Greetings, everyone. This is part two of the rhetorical fallacies. On the last video, we left off with ad populum, which was, if you remember, also called the bandwagon fallacy, and this asserts that something, because it's popular, it must be correct. This is an example would be in advertising when people talk about the number of customers who have switched to their company, and then they ask you why you haven't done it with the assumption that, well, if a bunch of people are doing it, it must be right. And of course, as you hopefully know, that if millions of people are doing it, it doesn't make it right. It just means that millions of people are doing it. Another example of ad populum is when someone makes a claim and they're asked for evidence and they simply say, well, everyone knows it's true. That's not evidence, and that is the ad populum fallacy. So moving on. The first of part two is going to be false dichotomy or false dilemma. And this is when a politician, an advertiser, or really anyone who's trying to convince you of something presents you with two options when others exist. They're making you choose between red or green when we all know that there are all sorts of different colors in the spectrum. And of course, that's an analogy I think of advertisers who like to give you the false dilemma of using a certain toothpaste, and they show you pictures of cavities and all this other stuff, and it talks about how this toothpaste fixes it, and they're essentially giving you a false dichotomy, which is to say that if you're not using our toothpaste, you're going to have cavities, which is not true. You can use other brands of toothpaste and not get cavities, or in some cases you can still get you can still use another brand and get a cavity. But false dichotomy is characterized by the language of either this or that. So either A or B, when C through Z are clear choices that exist. In class today, somebody brought up the question, would you rather, is it better to be rich or happy? And there were a few students who said, well, both. Like, why not both? Why not being rich and happy? So they kind of caught on that it was a false dichotomy. Next up is straw man. And straw man is where you take a complex argument or a complex issue and you basically reduce it to something really, really simple so that you can defeat it. So let's take abortion, for example. That is a complex issue. And so if someone is pro-life, again, that's a complex position. And so you can't tell someone, oh, well, if you're pro-life, you must hate women. That's not true. That's straw man. You're taking their complex views on a complex topic and boiling it down to something that is really simple so that you can either defeat it or achieve whatever rhetorical purpose you're attempting to achieve. Next up is slippery slope. This is the one thing leads to another fallacy. This is the fallacy that says that, well, if you fail say you failed a math test. Oh, you failed the math test. Next thing we know, you're going to be dropping out of high school. No, it's not how that works. There's a whole lot of steps in between. Failing a math test is not the end of the world, and it won't result. Failing one test or even two or three won't result in you dropping out. All right, so we're going to pick up from there. I noticed some information that needed to change, so I changed it. So we go from talking about the slippery slope with you failing a math test to somebody saying that you're going to drop out because you failed this test. That's slippery slope. Similarly, hasty generalization does some skipping over, much like a slippery slope does. Except hasty generalization, you don't use enough evidence to jump to a conclusion. For example, you say your team lost, and it's a football game. Your team lost 7-38. And you notice that one referee made one bad call. Well, you use that evidence to jump to the conclusion that clearly the game was fixed because the referee was paid off and was paid to make that bad call. Or maybe you jump to the conclusion that my team lost because none of the referees were good. Whatever it may be, you can say those things. But if we're playing by the rules of logic, especially Occam's razor. And for those that don't know, Occam's razor is the idea that the simplest explanation is often the correct one. Occam's razor would say, and logic would say that maybe your team lost because they just weren't as good as the other team. That's most often, that's a simple explanation, that's most often what it is. So hasty generalization is where you jump to a conclusion without sufficient evidence. It is important that you have enough evidence to support your claim, and I don't want to say too much is never enough, but often that's the case. You can never have too much evidence to support what you are asserting or claiming. Next up is red herring. This is when you throw in irrelevant evidence in a debate or discussion to distract from an issue. Let's go back to the math test. Let's say that you failed a math test and you're talking with your parents and they're obviously not happy because you failed a math test, and then in the middle of the discussion you say, well, I made an A on this science test. Your parents aren't going to care. They're going to be like, yeah, that's great, but we're still talking about you failing the math test. It doesn't change the conversation. So that's what red herring does, is you attempt to change the conversation by distracting from an issue. Next up is post hoc, and post hoc is short for post hoc ergo propter hoc, and it's Latin for after this, therefore, because this. I think that's it. And this claims that because two events correlate, they have a causal relationship. So let's say your friend Amy is absent on a Wednesday and the teacher gave a pop quiz that Wednesday and the teacher told nobody, and you say, oh, post hoc would say that Amy was absent and today was a pop quiz. She must have known about it, so she was absent. Well, no, that's not necessarily true. Just because two events correlate, it doesn't mean that they have a causal, like a cause and effect relationship. You've probably heard the phrase correlation does not equal causation. That's exactly what the post hoc fallacy is. Just because two things happen near the same time doesn't mean that they have a relationship, a causal one. All right, let's look at glittering generalities. This is when you use vague terms to appeal to emotion rather than logos or logic. So an example would be presidential campaigns using vague words like hope, change, and forward, as the Obama campaigns did in 2008 and 2012, or Make America Great Again, as Ronald Reagan did in 1980, and then Trump taking that in 2016. The problem with this is that these are very vague words. Everyone loves the word hope, and so if I'm saying like I believe in hope, I'm not really saying anything. And so I'm using very general terms. Other politicians will use terms like freedom and honor, and I believe in the honor. I believe in freedom. I believe in liberty, whatever it may be. And you're not going to find a politician who would disagree with that. No one's going to say that they don't believe in those things. So these are emotional terms that make us feel good, rather than them making like giving us any information that we can use. Same thing with Make America Great Again. Like, what do you mean by great? Like, whose definition of great? It's a very vague term that doesn't say anything. Scare tactics. This is appealing to pathos using undue fear. For example, politicians say my opponent is a radical liberal who wants to take your guns. And so, whereas on one hand, politicians try to get you to vote for them by making themselves seem appealing, they can also get you to try to vote for them by scaring you in regards to their opponent. So scare tactics. And scare tactics is about using undue, and undue just means unnecessary fear. Flag waving. This is a form of ad populum that appeals to nationalism. Terms or phrases like patriotic or made in America. You'll see that on ads when things will say, this was made in America. It doesn't say anything about the quality of what you're buying. It just says made in America. That's called flag waving. And so it doesn't allude to or give you any like factual information about what you're buying. And so it just hopes to appeal to your sense of nationalism to purchase something. Let's see, the next two are dog whistling and pearl clutching. I need to see how much time I have. Okay, I've got a good amount of time on the free version of Screencast-O-Matic. So we're going to talk about dog whistling. In politics, a dog whistle is the use of coded or suggestive language in political messaging to garner support from a particular group without provoking opposition. Dog whistling allows you to deny that you're saying something while still sending a message to your base. Now, dog whistling is often very negative. This version, the version I'm about to bring up, is not necessarily. In George W. Bush's 2003 State of the Union address, uh, he said that the American people had a wonder-working power. And at the time, if you were watching, if you weren't aware of the hymn Power in the Blood, you probably thought, oh, that just sounds, I like the alliteration. I like wonder working. That sounds nice. And it just sounded pleasing. But evangelical Christians who had heard the hymn knew that he was signaling them. He was saying wonder working power. It was his way of kind of signaling to his evangelical Christian base. And that's called a dog whistle. What Bush did in that moment wasn't necessarily a negative version of that. A negative version often appeals to racism using non-racist language. And so when they use non-racist language to make a racist or a sexist remark, they get to fall back on saying something like, well, that's not what I meant, or I didn't say that. And they kind of get away with using a dog whistle. So dog whistling is, I'm trying to think of an example. Oh, here we go. So dog whistling would be back in, from about '08 to around, 2016 throughout Barack Obama's presidential terms, you had people that would use his middle name, and his middle name was Hussein. And most Americans, when they hear the name Hussein, they think Saddam Hussein. But they would intentionally say Barack Hussein Obama to basically stoke anti-Muslim fears in their base voters. And people would call them on it. They would say, look, what you're doing is, it's wrong because you're stoking anti-Muslim fear. And people could say their defense was, what are you talking about? I'm just using his middle name. They know full well what they're doing. Their listeners know what they're doing. That's why it's called a dog whistle, is because it sometimes will go over the heads of most people. But in other cases, like the using of Obama's middle name, doing so intentionally and emphasizing it, the person who uses it gets to say, like, well, I was only using his middle name, when we all know that's a dog whistle. Next up is pearl clutching. This is outrage or dramatic protest. And this isn't really a rhetorical fallacy. Let's just go ahead and put that out there. This is more something that happens in politics. And this is when someone, you could just call it hypocrisy, they pretend to be outraged or pretend to be shocked over behavior that someone has either done, that someone has done when they themselves have either done it in the past or they've permitted it in the past. And this would be like, they pretend to be shocked at maybe someone, using a bad word when either they've used it themselves or using that kind of language isn't a big deal. It's pearl clutching to make people do that to make themselves seem morally superior to someone else. It's kind of like a how dare you approach, but it happens, and this is more politics, and it fits a little bit into scare tactics in a way, but you try to make someone else look immoral by being shocked at their behavior when either you yourself have engaged in that behavior or you've been okay in the past and allowed that behavior to happen without saying anything about it then. All right, that's the last slide. And so time is ticking. This is almost done. If you have any questions, shoot me a message. Take care.